The winter of 1762 arrived in St. Petersburg with a cruelty that seemed almost deliberate. By late January, the temperature had fallen so far below freezing that the Neva River had become a road of ice thick enough to bear the weight of laden carts. The wind came down from the Gulf of Finland in sheets, finding every gap in every wall, every poorly sealed window, every door that did not quite close. It was the kind of cold that killed silently, that found the homeless and the poor in doorways and left them there, frozen into positions that resembled sleep. It was the kind of cold that made fire a matter of life and death, that turned the gathering of wood into a question of survival. And in this cold, in this darkness, in this city built on bones and marshland, stood a building so vast, so overwhelmingly beautiful, that it seemed to belong to a different world entirely. The Winter Palace rose from the banks of the frozen river, like an argument against nature itself. Its walls were painted a shade of green that had no name in the Russian language at the time, a color somewhere between the needles of pine trees and the deep water of the Baltic on a summer afternoon. White columns marched along its facades in precise rhythm, their Corinthian capitals delicate as lace, despite being carved from stone that weighed more than most peasant houses. Gold gleamed from the window frames, from the ornamental details above each entrance, from the double-headed eagles that crowned the roofline and caught what little light the January sun could offer. The palace had been finished only weeks before, though the word finished would prove to be something of an exaggeration. Workers were still scrambling through unheated corridors, still plastering walls, still hanging mirrors that had been shipped at enormous expense from Venice. The Empress who had commissioned this building, who had poured what amounted to the annual income of entire provinces into its construction, would never see it completed. Elizabeth Petrovna, daughter of Peter the Great, had died on Christmas Day of 1761, just as her dream was finally taking physical form. She had been carried through half-finished rooms in her final months, too ill to walk but still demanding to inspect the progress, still changing her mind about the color of a ceiling or the placement of a stove. She died before the scaffolding came down. She died before the crystal chandeliers were hung. She died, in other words, without ever knowing whether her great project would be worth the cost. And the cost had been extraordinary, not extraordinary in the way that historians sometimes use the word, meaning notable or significant. Extraordinary in the sense that it exceeded all reasonable bounds, that it stretched the treasury of one of the largest empires on earth until the metal began to groan. The Winter Palace had consumed somewhere between 2.5 and 3 million rubles over 8 years of construction, a figure that meant nothing to the peasants who would ultimately pay for it in taxes, and meant everything to the administrators who watched the books with increasing alarm. To put this number in some kind of human context, the annual income of a skilled craftsman in St. Petersburg at the time was perhaps 50 rubles. A common laborer might earn 30. The Winter Palace, then, represented approximately 60,000 years of a laborer's wages. It was a building that could not be conceived of in ordinary human terms, because it existed on a scale that ordinary humans could not comprehend. But numbers alone cannot capture what Elizabeth was trying to create. She wanted more than a residence. She wanted more than a symbol of power. She wanted, in a way that was both childlike and desperate, to build a palace that would make every visitor feel small. She wanted the ambassadors of France and Austria and England to walk through her doors and understand, in their bodies rather than their minds, that Russia was no longer the backward country their grandfathers had dismissed. She wanted them to feel overwhelmed, and so she built a building designed specifically to overwhelm. The palace stretched for 250 meters along the riverbank, longer than 2 football fields laid end to end. though, of course, that measurement meant nothing in a world that had not yet invented football. Its facade rose through 3 stories to a height that dominated the surrounding city, which in those days was still largely built of wood. The roofline bristled with statues, sculptures of classical figures that had no particular meaning beyond their ornamental grandeur, and these stood against the gray sky like sentries from a more civilized age. The building enclosed an interior courtyard, large enough to conduct military exercises, though its primary purpose was to allow the carriages of guests to arrive in privacy, shielded from the curious eyes of the common people who gathered outside the gates. Inside, the palace contained over 1,000 rooms. The exact count varied depending on how you defined a room, whether you included the small chambers used by servants, the storage spaces, the corridors that were wide enough to be considered rooms in any lesser building. The number most commonly cited was 1,057, though this figure would change over time as walls were moved and spaces were subdivided. There were 1,786 doors, 1,945 windows, 117 staircases connecting the floors, and 460 rooms that could be heated, which meant that during the winter months, 697 rooms remained too cold for human occupation. The palace covered approximately 60,000 square meters of floor space, making it at that moment the largest royal residence in Europe, larger than Versailles, larger than the Hofburg in Vienna, larger than anything the English kings had ever dreamed of building. But size alone was merely the beginning. Elizabeth had insisted on interiors that would match the ambition of the exterior, and here her chief architect, Bartolomeo Francesco Rastrelli, had been given free rein to indulge his most theatrical instincts. The staterooms were designed not for comfort, but for spectacle. Ceilings soared to heights of 12 and 15 meters, making human beings seem like figurines placed in a dollhouse built for giants. These ceilings were covered with painted scenes from mythology, gods and goddesses cavorting in clouds, classical heroes performing deeds of valor, rendered in colors so vivid they seemed to glow. The walls were lined with silk fabric imported from Lyon at costs that would have fed villages, stretched over wooden frames and decorated with patterns that required dozens of craftsmen working for months to complete. The parquet floors were assembled from rare woods shipped from around the world, rosewood from Brazil, ebony from Africa, maple from the Russian forests, arranged in geometric patterns of such complexity that walking across them felt almost like trespassing on a work of art. And everywhere there was gold. Not actual gold in the structural sense. The walls were plaster, the decorative elements carved from wood and lime, but gold leaf applied in quantities that staggered the imagination. The gilding of the state apartments consumed hundreds of kilograms of gold over the course of construction. Every frame, every molding, every carved acanthus leaf, and every spiraling ornament was made to shimmer with that warm, eternal light that gold alone provides. The effect was not subtle. It was not meant to be subtle. It was meant to be blinding, disorienting, almost aggressive in its opulence. When the sun came through those nearly 2,000 windows, when it struck those gilded surfaces, the rooms seemed to catch fire with reflected light. Visitors described the experience as dreamlike, as intoxicating, as somehow unreal. But for every room that glittered, there were 10 that remained in shadow. The grandeur of the Winter Palace was like an iceberg. The visible portion represented only a fraction of the whole. Beneath the state floors, behind the decorated walls, below the awareness of the guests who came to attend balls and banquets, An entire hidden city operated around the clock to maintain the illusion of effortless splendor. The basement levels of the palace were a world unto themselves. Here, in corridors that never saw natural light, hundreds of workers went about the endless tasks that kept the building functioning. The kitchen complex alone occupied a space equivalent to a small factory. There were rooms for butchering meat, rooms for baking bread, rooms for preparing pastries, rooms for storing the ice that was cut from the frozen neve each winter and packed in straw to survive the summer months. There were wine cellars that held thousands of bottles imported from France and Germany and the Hungarian plains. There were root cellars where vegetables were kept in cool darkness for months at a time. The kitchen staff numbered in the hundreds during major events and even on ordinary days. Dozens of cooks and their assistants worked from before dawn until well after midnight to feed not just the imperial family, but the entire household, the chamberlains and secretaries, the guards and footmen, the maids and laundresses, and the workers who maintained all of them. The heating system represented one of the palace's most impressive and most demanding pieces of infrastructure. During the winter months, which in St. Petersburg meant roughly 8 months of the year, the building required constant feeding of fuel to prevent the inhabitants from freezing. The original design called for over 400 stoves distributed throughout the building, and these stoves consumed wood in quantities that boggled the mind. Estimates suggest that the Winter Palace burned through approximately 15,000 cubic meters of firewood annually, enough to heat an entire village for centuries, enough to strip entire forests from the Russian hinterland. The wood arrived by river during the summer when the Neva was navigable, and it was stacked in mountains along the riverbank before being hauled into the palace's storage areas. During the winter, teams of workers did nothing but carry wood from storage to the stoves, hour after hour, day after day, in a cycle that never ended because the cold never relented. Water presented another logistical challenge. There was no municipal water system in St. Petersburg in the 18th century, no network of pipes and pumps that could deliver water to the upper floors of such an enormous building. Instead, every drop of water used in the palace, for drinking, for cooking, for bathing, for cleaning, for the fountains that played in the courtyard during summer, had to be carried by hand. A small army of water carriers descended to the Neva or to wells dug into the marshy ground, filled their buckets, and climbed the staircases again and again, their shoulders bent under loads that would have broken lesser men within hours. During the winter, when the river froze, the ice had to be cut and melted before it could be used. During the summer, when the water grew warm and stagnant, additional workers were employed to fetch ice from the storage cellars and add it to the drinking supplies. The human labor involved in this single necessity, the simple provision of water, represented thousands of hours of work each day. Light in the palace presented its own challenges. Before the advent of gas and electricity, the only available sources of illumination were candles and oil lamps, and the Winter Palace consumed these in staggering quantities. The great chandeliers that hung in the staterooms held hundreds of candles each, and lighting them required servants to climb precarious ladders with tapers, working quickly before the wax began to drip. Keeping these chandeliers lit during a ball or reception meant constantly replacing candles that had burned down, adjusting wicks, cleaning the crystal pendants that became clouded with smoke. The cost of wax alone, beeswax for the state apartments, tallow for the servants' quarters, ran to figures that exceeded the annual budgets of lesser courts. And when the candles burned, they produced not just light, but heat and smoke, and an atmosphere that required constant ventilation, which meant opening windows even in the coldest months, which meant burning more wood to compensate for the lost warmth. The staff required to maintain all of this was itself a small city. Contemporary accounts suggest that the Winter Palace employed somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 servants during Elizabeth's reign, though exact figures are difficult to establish because record-keeping was inconsistent and many workers were not considered worthy of documentation. There were chamberlains and majordomos, valets and ladies-in-waiting, cooks and pastry chefs and confectioners, wine stewards and cellar masters, footmen who stood motionless for hours in heated livery, gardeners who maintained the indoor plants that Elizabeth insisted upon even in the depths of winter. There were laundresses who washed the thousands of napkins and tablecloths used at state dinners, seamstresses who repaired the miles of silk that lined the walls, upholsterers who tended to the furniture that was constantly wearing out under the strain of use. There were candle makers and blacksmiths and carpenters and glaziers and painters whose job was never finished because a building of this size was always in some state of disrepair. And beneath even these workers were the truly invisible ones, the serfs who had no choice in their employment, who had been attached to the imperial household by birth or by purchase, who could be bought and sold like livestock, and who had no legal recourse if they were mistreated. These were the people who emptied the chamber pots and cleaned the fireplaces and hauled the water and the wood and the garbage. They slept in unheated dormitories in the basement levels, 3 or 4 to a bed for warmth, and their lives were measured in units of labor rather than years. Many of them had been brought to St. Petersburg from distant estates and would never see their home villages again. Many of them died young, worn out by work that allowed no rest. They were the foundation upon which the entire edifice rested, and they were, by design, invisible. The woman who created all of this, who commissioned this building, who drove its construction with relentless energy, who spent money she did not have on luxuries she could not resist, was herself a study in contradictions. Elizabeth Petrovna had been born in 1709, the daughter of Peter the Great and his second wife, Catherine, who had begun life as a peasant before catching the eye of the most powerful man in Russia. Elizabeth's childhood was one of extraordinary privilege, interrupted by moments of genuine danger. Her father died when she was 15, and the subsequent decades brought a series of power struggles that repeatedly threatened to destroy her. She was considered illegitimate by those who questioned the validity of her parents' marriage. She was considered unfit to rule by those who preferred a male heir. She was considered a threat by those who did rule and who feared her popularity with the guards and the common people. For 20 years, Elizabeth lived in a kind of gilded uncertainty. She was given a generous allowance, but kept at arm's length from power. She was surrounded by luxury, but always aware that she might lose everything at any moment. She developed habits that would define her reign, a love of clothes so consuming that she reportedly owned over 15,000 dresses at the time of her death, a passion for dancing and theater that made the Russian court legendary for its entertainments, a deep religious faith that coexisted oddly with her hedonistic tendencies. She was tall and beautiful, with fair skin and auburn hair, and she knew how to use her appearance to political advantage. She was also impulsive, emotional, prone to fits of temper that terrified her courtiers, and capable of holding grudges for decades. In 1741, when she was 32 years old, Elizabeth staged a coup that brought her to power. She dressed in military attire, led a regiment of loyal guards to the Winter Palace, a different Winter Palace, the third to bear that name, a building far smaller and less impressive than the one she would commission, and arrested the infant Tsar Ivan VI and his regent mother. The coup was bloodless, almost theatrical, and it succeeded largely because Elizabeth had spent years cultivating the loyalty of the soldiers who would carry it out. She was crowned empress the following year, and she immediately began spending money on a scale that alarmed her advisors. The old Winter Palace was not good enough for her. It was too small, too plain, too reminiscent of the rulers who had tried to keep her from power. She wanted something that would announce to the world that a new era had begun. In 1754, she issued the order for construction to begin on what would become the Fourth Winter Palace, the building that still stands today. The commission went to Bartolomeo Francesco Rastrelli, an Italian-born architect who had spent most of his career in Russia and who shared Elizabeth's taste for the theatrical and the overwhelming. Rastrelli was a genius of a particular kind, not the kind of genius that values simplicity or restraint, but the kind that cannot resist adding another column, another flourish, another room. His style was Baroque in its essence, a style that had fallen somewhat out of fashion in Western Europe, but that suited Russian tastes perfectly. The Baroque was a style of movement and drama, of curved facades and soaring ceilings, of architecture that seemed to be in the process of becoming something more than architecture. Rastrelli understood that Elizabeth wanted to feel like she was living inside a dream, and he designed accordingly. The construction process was itself a monument to imperial power and imperial indifference. Thousands of workers were conscripted for the project, many of them serfs who had no choice in the matter. They came from all over Russia, pulled from their villages, and transported to St. Petersburg, where they joined the permanent workforce of laborers who were already struggling to maintain the city that Peter the Great had willed into existence on this swampy, unhealthy ground. The conditions on the construction site were brutal. Workers lived in temporary shelters that offered little protection from the elements. They were fed poorly and paid rarely, if at all. Medical care was essentially non-existent. Injuries were common and often fatal, not because of malice, but because safety simply was not a consideration in 18th century construction. The foundation work alone took over a year, as workers drove thousands of wooden piles into the marshy ground to create a stable base for the enormous building. The soil of St. Petersburg was treacherous, waterlogged, unstable, prone to flooding during the violent storms that regularly swept in from the Baltic. Every major building in the city was an act of defiance against nature, and the Winter Palace was no exception. The piles had to be long enough to reach solid ground, which in some places meant driving them more than 10 meters into the earth. The labor was backbreaking and dangerous, and contemporary accounts mention casually that workers were lost to accidents without specifying how many or how frequently. Once the foundation was established, the walls began to rise. The primary material was brick, manufactured in kilns along the Neva and transported to the site by the thousands. The exterior facing was plaster, tinted with pigments to achieve the distinctive green color that Elizabeth preferred, a color that would be changed repeatedly over the following centuries as tastes shifted and new emperors imposed their preferences. The interior walls were constructed to accommodate the elaborate decorations that would come later, with recesses for mirrors, with niches for stoves, with channels for the primitive ventilation systems that would attempt, largely unsuccessfully, to manage the smoke from thousands of candles. The materials came from everywhere. Stone for the columns and staircases came from quarries in Finland and the Ural Mountains, transported by ship and by cart at enormous expense. Wood for the floors came from forests all over Russia, selected for grain and color and durability. The exotic woods used in the most important parquet floors, the rosewood and the ebony and the satinwood, came from trading posts in Africa and South America, completing journeys that took months or even years. Glass for the windows came from Russian factories that had been established specifically to reduce dependence on foreign imports. The crystal for the chandeliers, however, still came primarily from Bohemia and Venice, because Russian manufacturing had not yet achieved the necessary quality. The silk for the walls came from Lyon, the gilt bronze for the door handles came from Paris, the marble for the fireplaces came from Italy. The Winter Palace was, in this sense, a monument not just to Russian wealth but to the global trading networks that connected Russia to the wider world. The workforce on the site fluctuated with the seasons and with the availability of labor, but at its peak, somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 workers were employed simultaneously. They were organized into crews with specific responsibilities: masons and bricklayers, carpenters and joiners, plasterers and painters, gilders and glaziers. Master craftsmen supervised the most delicate work, while unskilled laborers hauled materials and performed the endless grunt work that construction requires. There were fights and thefts and desertions, and there were punishments, beatings and imprisonment, and, for the serfs, the constant threat of being sent to worse assignments or sold to new owners who might be even more brutal. Elizabeth drove the project relentlessly. She visited the site frequently, despite her declining health, and she was never satisfied with the pace of progress. In the final years of construction, as her illness worsened, she demanded that work continue around the clock, which meant working by torchlight through the short winter nights. She ordered additional workers to be conscripted, additional funds to be allocated, additional pressure to be applied to architects and foremen who were already working beyond reasonable limits. The building was completed, in a technical sense, only weeks before her death, and even then, as mentioned, significant work remained to be done. The irony of Elizabeth's death just as the palace was finished has not been lost on historians. She had poured her dreams and her treasury into this building, and she barely had time to walk through its finished rooms before being carried to her deathbed. The palace that was meant to immortalize her became instead the setting for her final hours and the home of her successors. She died in the Winter Palace on December 25th, 1761, Christmas Day by the old Julian calendar still in use in Russia, and her body lay in state in rooms that still smelled of fresh plaster and wet paint. The throne passed first to her nephew, Peter III, a man so spectacularly unsuited to rule that his reign lasted only 6 months. Peter had been raised in Germany and remained culturally German in his attitudes and preferences. He openly admired Frederick the Great of Prussia, Russia's enemy in the ongoing 7 Years' War, and he alienated virtually every faction at court with his erratic behavior and his contempt for Russian traditions. He was also, crucially, married to a woman of far greater intelligence and ambition than his own, a German princess who had converted to Orthodoxy, learned Russian, and adopted the name Catherine. While Peter played with toy soldiers and neglected his wife, Catherine cultivated the same networks of military officers and court insiders that had brought Elizabeth to power 2 decades earlier. In July of 1762, less than 7 months after Elizabeth's death, Catherine launched her own coup. Peter was arrested, forced to abdicate, and died under mysterious circumstances a few days later. Catherine was crowned empress, and she would rule Russia for more than 30 years, earning the epithet the Great and transforming both the empire and the palace that had become her home. Catherine's relationship with the Winter Palace was different from Elizabeth's. Where Elizabeth had created the building as an expression of her personal vision, Catherine inherited it as a fact, a structure that was already complete, already magnificent, already overwhelming. Her task was not to build, but to fill, to use, to adapt. and she approached this task with the same analytical intelligence that characterized all her endeavors. Catherine recognized that the Winter Palace, for all its grandeur, was essentially a stage set. It was designed to project power, to awe visitors, to create a sense of imperial majesty that could compete with the courts of Western Europe. But a stage set requires actors and scripts and audiences, and Catherine understood that the real power of the palace lay not in its architecture, but in how it was used. She hosted balls and receptions that became legendary for their scale and their sophistication. She invited philosophers and artists and scientists to her court, positioning herself as an enlightened monarch in the mold of the great thinkers of the age. She collected art with a passion that bordered on obsession, acquiring entire collections from impoverished aristocrats and bankrupt dealers and deceased collectors, until her paintings and sculptures began to overflow the palace's available space. It was Catherine who established the Hermitage, originally a private retreat attached to the Winter Palace where she could display her growing collection and entertain guests away from the formality of the state rooms. The name meant a place of solitude, and it was characteristic of Catherine's wit that she used it for a building that would eventually become one of the greatest museums in the world. She built and rebuilt the Hermitage multiple times during her reign, expanding it to house her ever-growing collections, until it became a complex of buildings that merged with the Winter Palace itself into a single enormous cultural institution. But Catherine's transformation of the palace was not limited to the accumulation of art. She also reformed its operation, imposing a more rational organization on the chaos of Elizabeth's household. She reduced the number of personal servants, consolidated redundant positions, established clearer lines of authority. She was not, in any meaningful sense, concerned with the welfare of the workers who served her. She was a practical despot, not a humanitarian. But she was concerned with efficiency, and efficiency required order. The result was a household that was somewhat better managed, if no less demanding on those who labored to sustain it. The fundamental economics of the Winter Palace, however, remained unchanged. The building still required vast quantities of fuel to heat, vast quantities of labor to maintain, vast quantities of money to operate. Catherine was wealthier than Elizabeth had been, partly because she had inherited an empire that was growing rapidly, partly because she was more careful with her resources. But even so, the palace consumed a significant fraction of the imperial budget. The annual operating costs ran into the hundreds of thousands of rubles, a figure that exceeded the entire revenue of many European principalities. And these costs did not include the constant repairs and renovations that the building required, nor the periodic catastrophes that threatened to destroy it entirely. Fire was the constant fear. The palace was, despite its stone exterior, largely constructed of wood on the inside. The floors were wood, the decorative elements were wood, the framework supporting the plaster walls was wood, and the building was illuminated by open flames, candles and oil lamps, and, in some areas, braziers that warmed particular rooms. Every night, thousands of flames burned throughout the palace, and the risk of one of them escaping its containment was always present. Fire brigades were stationed in the building, with buckets and pumps and sand, but everyone understood that if a major fire took hold, it would be nearly impossible to stop. The palace had burned before, in earlier incarnations, and it would burn again. The fire of 1837, which occurred half a century after Catherine's death, was the most devastating. It began in a heating duct, sparked by a chimney fire that had not been fully extinguished. By the time the flames were noticed, they had already spread behind the walls, racing through the wooden framework that supported the plaster. Within hours, The fire had consumed the entire interior of the palace. The exterior walls survived, but everything inside, the silk hangings, the gilded decorations, the precious parquet floors, the painted ceilings, was destroyed. Soldiers and servants formed human chains to evacuate what they could, throwing furniture and artwork from windows into the snow below, but the vast majority of the palace's contents were lost. The flames burned for 3 days before finally dying down, leaving a frozen shell that looked from the outside almost unchanged, but that was, on the inside, utterly ruined. The reconstruction took 3 years and involved a mobilization of resources that rivaled the original construction. Tsar Nicholas I personally supervised much of the work, visiting the site daily and driving the laborers with the same relentless energy that Elizabeth had shown a century before. The palace was rebuilt to look almost exactly as it had before the fire. The staterooms recreated from surviving drawings and descriptions, the decorative elements reproduced by craftsmen trained in 18th century techniques. But the reconstruction also incorporated improvements that made the building somewhat safer and somewhat more modern. Metal was used more extensively in the structural framework, reducing the fire risk. Ventilation systems were improved to reduce the buildup of smoke, and the heating system was redesigned, though it still relied on the same fundamental technology of burning wood in stoves distributed throughout the building. The cost of the reconstruction was never officially disclosed, but estimates suggest that it exceeded 15 million rubles, 5 or 6 times the original construction cost, though inflation makes direct comparison difficult. The money came from the imperial treasury, which meant, ultimately, that it came from the Russian people in the form of taxes and the extraction of resources from state-owned lands. The peasants who paid these taxes had no voice in the decision to rebuild, no ability to question whether a palace was worth more than roads or schools or hospitals. They simply paid, as they had always paid, because the alternative was punishment or death. This, then, was the fundamental equation of the Winter Palace: extraordinary beauty purchased at the cost of extraordinary extraction. The building existed because Russian society was organized in such a way that a small number of people at the top could command the labor and resources of millions at the bottom. It was not a secret, this arrangement. It was simply the way things were, accepted by those who benefited from it and endured by those who did not. But the acceptance was never complete, and the endurance was never without limit. The seeds of revolution had been planted long before the Winter Palace was built, but the palace itself became, over time, one of the most visible symbols of everything that was wrong with the old order. It was too beautiful, too excessive, too obvious a testament to the inequality that defined Russian life. When revolutionaries wanted to explain what they were fighting against, they pointed to the Winter Palace. When radicals wanted to demonstrate the decadence of the monarchy, they described the Winter Palace. The building was not the cause of the discontent that would eventually tear Russia apart, but it was its most perfect embodiment. The first major crisis came in 1825 with the Decembrist Revolt, a group of military officers influenced by liberal ideas they had encountered during the Napoleonic Wars attempted to seize power during the confusion following the death of Alexander III. Their plan was poorly organized and their numbers were small, but they gathered in Senate Square within sight of the Winter Palace, and for a few hours the fate of the empire hung in the balance. The revolt was crushed. The leaders were executed or exiled, and Nicholas I used the incident to justify a regime of repression that would last for 30 years. But the Decembrists had demonstrated that the old order was not eternal, that the walls of the Winter Palace could be challenged. The next crisis came in 1881, when Alexander II, the Tsar who had freed the serfs 2 decades earlier, was assassinated by revolutionaries who believed that even his reforms had not gone far enough. The bomb that killed him exploded on the streets of St. Petersburg, not far from the Winter Palace, and his bloody body was carried back to the palace to die. The assassination terrified the imperial family and transformed the palace from a residence into a fortress. Security was increased dramatically, with police and soldiers stationed throughout the building and its surroundings. The new Tsar, Alexander III, retreated to a smaller palace outside the city, finding the Winter Palace too exposed, too vulnerable, too haunted by his father's death. The crisis of 1905 was different, a spontaneous uprising that brought ordinary Russians into direct confrontation with the power of the state. On January 9th, a Sunday, a peaceful demonstration marched toward the Winter Palace to present a petition to the Tsar. The demonstrators were workers and their families, led by a priest, and they came carrying icons and singing hymns. They believed, with a naivety that seems heartbreaking in retrospect, that if they could only speak to the Tsar, he would hear their grievances and address their suffering. But the Tsar was not in the palace that day. He had retreated to one of his country estates, and the soldiers who guarded the building received orders to disperse the crowd by force. The massacre that followed became known as Bloody Sunday. Soldiers opened fire on unarmed demonstrators, killing hundreds and wounding thousands. The exact numbers were never established because the authorities had every incentive to minimize them, but estimates range from several hundred to more than 1,000 dead. The massacre transformed Russian politics, shattering the myth that the Tsar was a benevolent father who cared for his people. In the aftermath, strikes and uprisings spread across the country, forcing the government to concede limited reforms that included the establishment of an elected legislature. The revolution of 1905 was eventually suppressed, but it had demonstrated that the old order was crumbling. The final crisis came in 1917 when the accumulated pressures of war and hunger and political paralysis finally became too much to bear. The February Revolution began with bread riots in St. Petersburg, now renamed Petrograd to sound less German, and spread rapidly until the entire fabric of the state began to unravel. Tsar Nicholas II, the last of the Romanov dynasty, abdicated in March, and a provisional government took power that was itself too weak to survive. For 8 months, Russia existed in a kind of suspended animation, waiting for the next blow to fall. The October Revolution was that blow. On the night of October 25th, November 7th by the new calendar that would soon be adopted, Bolshevik forces led by Vladimir Lenin moved to seize power. The provisional government had relocated to the Winter Palace, which was defended by a small and demoralized force of military cadets, Cossacks, and members of a women's battalion. The Bolsheviks surrounded the palace and issued an ultimatum. When no response came, they began their assault. The storming of the Winter Palace was, in reality, a rather anticlimactic affair. There was some shooting, but most of the defenders simply melted away as it became clear that resistance was futile. The Bolshevik forces entered the building through doors that were unlocked or barely guarded, streaming through corridors that had once been walked by empresses and czars. They arrested the ministers of the provisional government who had gathered in a back room to await their fate. The revolution, at least in its physical dimension, was accomplished in a matter of hours with minimal bloodshed. But the symbolic significance of the event was enormous. For generations, the Winter Palace had represented the power and permanence of the imperial order. It had been built to overwhelm, and for nearly 2 centuries, it had succeeded. Now it had fallen, not to an external enemy, but to the people over whom it had loomed for so long. The Bolsheviks understood the propaganda value of their conquest, and they would use it for decades to come. Films would recreate the storming of the palace in heroic terms, with thousands of revolutionaries charging across Palace Square in the face of withering fire. These films bore little resemblance to what actually happened, but they captured the emotional truth of the moment. The old world was dead, and a new world was being born. The transformation of the Winter Palace from imperial residence to public museum began almost immediately. The Bolsheviks recognized that they could not simply destroy the building. It was too historically significant, too valuable as a symbol of their victory, and too full of art treasures that the new state claimed as the property of the people. Instead, they decreed that the palace would become part of an expanded Hermitage museum, open to all citizens rather than reserved for the elite. The decision was partly pragmatic. Museums were politically safe, and the new government had more pressing concerns than debating the fate of palace furniture. But it was also ideological. By converting the palace into a museum, the Bolsheviks could claim that they were not destroying the past, but liberating it, making available to everyone what had once belonged only to a few. The transition was not smooth. The palace had been designed for the needs of an imperial household, not the demands of public visitation. The rooms were too fragile for heavy foot traffic. The heating and lighting systems were inadequate for public use. The staff who had served the Romanovs were gone, replaced by inexperienced workers who had no training in conservation or curation. In the chaotic years following the revolution, the palace suffered from neglect and from outright theft. Artworks disappeared, furniture was damaged, the gardens fell into disrepair. The new Soviet government was fighting a civil war, struggling to feed its population, and had little time or money to devote to the preservation of a Tsarist relic. The situation stabilized somewhat during the 1920s and 30s as the Soviet Union consolidated its power and turned its attention to cultural matters. The Hermitage was reorganized along more professional lines, with trained curators and conservators and a coherent approach to collections management. The museum began to attract visitors in significant numbers, drawn by curiosity about the overthrown regime and by genuine interest in the art treasures it contained. For the first time in its history, the Winter Palace was open to ordinary Russians who could walk through the same rooms that had once been reserved for empresses and courtiers. But the greatest test of the palace's survival came not from revolution, but from war. When German forces invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, the city of Leningrad, as St. Petersburg had been renamed after Lenin's death, found itself directly in the path of the advance. By September, the city was completely surrounded, cut off from the rest of the Soviet Union by land. The siege that followed would last nearly 900 days and would become one of the most horrific episodes in the entire history of modern warfare. The Hermitage staff had begun evacuating the most valuable artworks as soon as the invasion began. More than 1 million objects were packed into crates and loaded onto trains heading east to cities in the Ural Mountains where they would be safe from bombing. The evacuation was a remarkable feat of organization and dedication, carried out under impossible conditions by staff who worked around the clock for weeks. But there were not enough trains, not enough time, not enough crates. Much of the collection had to be left behind, hidden in the basement levels of the palace, or simply left in place because there was no other option. What followed was a siege of unimaginable brutality. German forces bombarded the city continuously, destroying homes and factories and infrastructure. The food supply, which had never been adequate, dwindled to almost nothing. During the first winter, rations fell to less than 300 grams of bread per day, bread that was mixed with sawdust and cotton because there was not enough flour. People began to die, first by the hundreds, then by the thousands, then by the tens of thousands. Bodies lay in the streets because there was no one with the strength to bury them. Estimates of the total death toll range from 600,000 to more than 1 million people, the vast majority of them civilians who died of starvation and disease. The Winter Palace stood at the center of this horror. The building was hit by artillery shells and by bombs, suffering significant damage to its exterior and interior. But it was never destroyed, partly because the German forces wanted to capture it intact as a trophy, and partly because Soviet air defenses made concentrated attacks difficult. Inside the palace, a small group of staff remained throughout the siege, living in the basement levels and emerging periodically to inspect the damage and protect what remained of the collections. They were cold and hungry, like everyone else in Leningrad. Some of them died from starvation or from illness, or from the shells that rained down on the city. But they stayed, guarding the art that had been entrusted to their care. The siege was finally broken in January of 1944, when Soviet forces opened a corridor to the city that allowed supplies to flow in, and some of the weakest residents to be evacuated. The city itself was not fully liberated until the following year, when German forces were driven back far enough that the artillery could no longer reach the streets. By the time the war ended, Leningrad was a city of ghosts, its population reduced by more than half, its buildings scarred and broken, its survivors traumatized in ways that would never fully heal. The restoration of the Winter Palace began immediately after the war and continued for decades. The damage was extensive, but not irreparable. Roofs had to be replaced, windows had to be reglazed, walls had to be repaired. The most severely damaged rooms had to be completely reconstructed, using period photographs and surviving plans to recreate what had been lost. The evacuated collections were returned from the east, carefully unpacked and reinstalled in galleries that had been cleaned and restored. By the early 1950s, the Hermitage was once again open to the public, and the Winter Palace had resumed its role as one of the world's great cultural institutions. But the palace was no longer the same institution it had been before the revolution, and the Soviet government that now controlled it had its own ideas about how it should be run. The Hermitage became a vehicle for propaganda as much as for culture, with exhibitions designed to emphasize the achievements of Soviet society and the decadence of the regime it had replaced. The interpretation of the palace's history was strictly controlled, with any suggestion that the old order had merits being firmly suppressed. Staff were vetted for political reliability, and the museum's administration was supervised by party officials who knew little about art, but much about ideological conformity. At the same time, the Soviet government invested significantly in the museum's physical infrastructure. New climate control systems were installed to protect the collections. Conservation laboratories were established to repair damaged artworks. Research programs were launched to study the museum's holdings in detail. The Hermitage developed a professional staff of curators and conservators who, despite the political constraints under which they worked, maintained high standards of scholarship and care. The museum received millions of visitors annually, most of them Soviet citizens who came to see with their own eyes the treasures that were now supposedly the property of the people. The fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 brought new challenges and new opportunities. The Hermitage, like every institution in Russia, faced a sudden collapse in government funding and a period of economic chaos that threatened its survival. Staff went unpaid for months at a time, Essential repairs were delayed because there was no money to pay for them. The museum was forced to look for alternative sources of revenue, experimenting with entrance fees, gift shops, and commercial events that would have been unthinkable under the old regime. It was a time of crisis, but also a time of liberation from the ideological constraints that had shaped the museum's operations for 70 years. Under the leadership of Mikhail Piotrovsky, who became director in 1992 and would hold the position for more than 3 decades, the Hermitage transformed itself into a modern international museum. It opened satellite branches in Amsterdam and London and Las Vegas, bringing its collections to audiences that would never visit St. Petersburg. It partnered with museums around the world to organize exhibitions and exchange expertise. It embraced digital technology, creating virtual tours that allowed anyone with an internet connection to explore its galleries. It launched ambitious renovation projects, restoring rooms that had been neglected for decades and opening new spaces that had previously been closed to the public. The challenges of managing the Winter Palace in the 21st century remain formidable. The building is now more than 260 years old, and despite the reconstructions and renovations, its infrastructure is perpetually in need of attention. The heating system, though no longer dependent on wood-burning stoves, still struggles to maintain consistent temperatures across such an enormous structure. The electrical system, which was installed piecemeal over more than a century, is a patchwork of different technologies that requires constant monitoring. Water damage from leaking roofs and burst pipes remains an ongoing threat. And the sheer number of visitors, more than 3 million in a typical year, creates wear and tear that never ends. The staff of the Hermitage now numbers in the thousands, including curators, conservators, security guards, maintenance workers, and administrative personnel. Operating costs run into the tens of millions of dollars annually, funded by a combination of government subsidies, entrance fees, and commercial revenue. The museum owns more than 3 million objects, of which only a small fraction can be displayed at any given time. The rest are stored in depots scattered around the city, each requiring its own security and climate control. Managing this vast collection is a logistical challenge that would have been unimaginable to Elizabeth or Catherine, but it is simply part of the daily reality for the institution they created. Conservation work continues around the clock in laboratories that Elizabeth would not have recognized but would certainly have appreciated. Teams of specialists work to stabilize deteriorating fabrics, to repair cracked paintings, to prevent the gilt surfaces from flaking away. They use technologies that did not exist a generation ago: laser cleaning, digital imaging, chemical analysis, to understand and preserve objects that were created in the 18th century using techniques that have been largely forgotten. The work is painstaking and expensive and never finished, because entropy is always at work, slowly degrading everything that has been built. The economic model of the modern Hermitage is a constant balancing act. The museum must attract enough visitors to generate revenue, but too many visitors threaten to damage the very objects they come to see. It must maintain its scholarly reputation through research and publication, but it must also appeal to casual tourists who have no interest in academic debates. It must preserve its historical character, but it must also adapt to the expectations of modern audiences who demand air conditioning and accessible restrooms and gift shops where they can buy reproductions. Every decision involves trade-offs, and every trade-off has consequences that will ripple forward through time. And through all of this, the fundamental question that has haunted the Winter Palace since its construction remains unanswered. What is it for? Elizabeth built it to project power, to awe foreign visitors, to satisfy her own appetite for magnificence. Catherine used it as a home and a showcase for her collections. The Romanov dynasty lived in it for generations, accumulating memories and traditions that were obliterated in a matter of hours in 1917. The Soviet state turned it into a monument to its own triumph, a symbol of the old order overthrown. The post-Soviet hermitage has made it a destination for cultural tourism, a generator of revenue, a source of national pride. Each of these uses has left its mark on the building, and each has shaped what it means. The Winter Palace is a palimpsest of purposes, a structure whose significance has been constantly rewritten by those who have controlled it. It is also, and has always been, a system of hidden costs, costs that are paid by people who rarely appear in the official histories. The serfs who built it are remembered, if at all, as an anonymous mass. The servants who maintained it are footnotes at best. The workers who keep it running today are invisible to most visitors, who see only the gilded surfaces and not the labor that sustains them. The beauty of the Winter Palace is real. The craftsmanship that went into its construction was genuine. The art that it contains is of extraordinary quality. The experience of walking through its galleries is unlike anything else in the world. But this beauty did not come from nowhere, and it does not sustain itself. It was purchased with resources extracted from a society organized around radical inequality, and it survives only through the continuous effort of people who will never be celebrated in the way that Rastrelli and Elizabeth and Catherine are celebrated. The palace is a monument to human achievement, but it is also a monument to the costs of that achievement, costs that were borne disproportionately by those with the least power to refuse. The revolutions that eventually swept away the old order were not caused by the Winter Palace. The causes were deeper and more complex, rooted in economic structures and political failures and the accidents of history. But the palace was a symbol of everything the revolutionaries were fighting against, and when they finally seized it, they believed they were ending an era of injustice and beginning something new. What they built instead was a different kind of injustice, but that is another story. The Winter Palace survived, adapted, and continues to exist, carrying with it the memories of all the systems that created and used it. This, perhaps, is the answer to the question that the palace poses. Great buildings do not survive because they are beautiful or historically significant or admired by scholars. They survive because someone decides to keep them alive, because someone commits the resources and the labor necessary to prevent their decay. Beauty is not self-sustaining. It requires feeding constantly with money and attention and work. When that feeding stops, decay begins immediately. The Winter Palace has survived because, through all its transformations, there has always been someone who believed it was worth preserving and who had the power to act on that belief. Whether the palace will survive the next century is a question that cannot be answered. Climate change threatens the city itself, which sits just a few meters above sea level and is already experiencing more frequent flooding than at any time in its history. Economic pressures may force difficult choices about which buildings to maintain and which to let go. Political instability may shift priorities in ways that are impossible to predict. The palace has survived wars and revolutions and fires, but there is no guarantee that it will survive whatever comes next. What is certain is that if it survives, it will be because people made it survive. It will be because workers went to work every day, because conservators treated deteriorating fabrics, because managers made difficult decisions about how to allocate limited resources. The palace will not survive on the strength of its past glory or the admiration of distant audiences. It will survive, if it survives, because of the labor of people who may never be remembered by name, but whose work is the only thing that stands between the building and the patient, inexorable forces of decay. In the winter of 2024, the temperature in St. Petersburg falls just as it fell in 1762. The river freezes, the wind comes down from the Gulf, and the cold finds every crack in every wall. The Winter Palace still stands on the Neva, still painted in that distinctive green, still glittering with gold. Tourists still come by the thousands to walk through its galleries and marvel at its beauty. And somewhere in the basement, workers still carry out the endless tasks that keep the building standing, repairing, cleaning, maintaining, preserving. They are the latest in an unbroken chain of workers that stretches back to the serfs who drove the first piles into the marshy ground, and they will be followed by others who will do the same work after they are gone. The palace asks, as it has always asked, whether beauty is worth its cost. Different eras have answered differently, and future eras will answer in their own ways. But the question persists, unanswerable and inescapable, because it is built into the stones and the gilding and the parquet floors. The Winter Palace is a building that should not exist, too expensive, too demanding, too utterly impractical for any purpose that could be rationally justified. And yet it exists, and it is beautiful, and people continue to believe that its existence is worth the cost. Perhaps that belief is enough. Perhaps the palace survives not because it earns its survival, but because humans are capable of committing themselves to purposes that transcend economic calculation. Perhaps the workers who maintain the building and the visitors who admire it are participating in something larger than any of them could create alone, a continuous act of devotion to beauty that has lasted for more than 2.5 centuries and may last for centuries more. Or perhaps the whole enterprise is a kind of madness, a refusal to accept that resources spent on gilding could have been spent on feeding the hungry or housing the poor. The palace does not resolve this tension, it simply embodies it, holding both possibilities in suspension like a cord that never resolves. The sun sets over the Winter Palace, as it has set every evening for 260 years. The light catches the gold, the windows reflect the fading sky, and the building seems to glow from within. In a few hours, the tourists will be gone, the galleries will be empty, and the night staff will begin their rounds, checking locks and monitoring temperatures, and watching over the treasures that the centuries have accumulated. They will work through the darkness, and when morning comes, they will be replaced by others who will do the same, and the palace will stand for another day because people believe it is worth standing. Great beauty, the Winter Palace teaches, does not survive on admiration alone. It endures only through continuous effort, through compromise, through the labor of people who understand that preservation is not an act completed once, but a process that never ends. This is the cost of beauty, and it is the cost that every beautiful thing demands. The only question is whether we are willing to pay it, generation after generation, until there are no more generations left to pay. If the true price of extraordinary beauty is paid not by those who enjoy it, but by those who never enter its doors, can any monument ever be separated from the inequality that built it?